Thank you so much for joining us. I'm David, your host of the Leadership Revolution podcast. We are continuing our series, Teaching the Change Lives. And I have a special guest with us today. My guest is a motivational senior executive director and a consultant with more than 20 years of success across nonprofit, government, and private sectors. She holds positions as a CEO of CC Inc., president of the Loving Our Child Inc., and chief editor of Blended Magazine, and most recently, founder of Unchurched. I'm excited to learn more about that. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my guest, the great Cynthia Camble.
Oh, thank you. I'm so honored to be here.
Awesome. So thank you so much for saying yes to this, being on the show of Teaching to Change Lives. But before we get into the show, right, like our listeners probably may not be familiar with who you are, what you do. So tell us a little bit more about who you are. Like, what was your background growing up? What was life growing up in your community? Can you share more of that?
Well, I actually grew up in Colorado Springs for the most part. What? I'm a Air Force brat, so travel a lot, but we always seem to come back here every 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And it was, I was in Air Force Academy, but we transitioned to Sierra the first year it was open. Okay. And then, unfortunately, my parents got divorced, and then that's when different things happen in trauma and things that people don't know about me. Mostly, a lot of them know the leader side of me, but they didn't know that I was a victim of human trafficking. Wow. I was someone tried to kidnap me and all, but I escaped out of there, and then that's how I got into advocacy and training awareness.
Wow, you just revealed so much. Like one, there's so much to unpack, right? How did you escape? Did you know who kidnapped you? And then second, how did you escape?
Yeah, I knew the person, and that's usually what happens with most human trafficking is someone that you know. It was an employer that I was supposed to be working with, and the situation was like, oh, we got to stop by his house, and to get some paperwork. But instead he locked the door and drove through the garage, but I got out through the window. So yeah, and then I never told anyone until I started getting involved with human trafficking about 5-6 years ago, and that's when I wrote my first book, just to deal with that trauma and have people not to have shame when they go through domestic violence or things like that. So,
wow. Yeah. So when you got away, where did you go?
I actually went back home.
Yeah.
I was staying with my mom. I was just 17 at the time. Yeah. And then, but because he's an outstanding citizen, no one wanted to believe me. Mm. And so then after that, I graduated from Sierra. I lived on the streets for the last 2 months on there, and then went to work, and no one knew. I just went to work, went to school and everything else, lived a life, got married, and then not until 20 years later did I even first time talk about it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So these exterior things are just happening. You're living on the streets, and no one wanted to believe you because this person was a stand-up person in the community. And what was it like internally? What were you thinking? What were you feeling when you were going through all of these things? Because look at you're here now. So what was going on then? I felt like shame, and I was like, well, what did I do to bring this on myself? Even though I wasn't, I had always been very conservative and everything else. So it was just and to come from a family that's, highly regarded, then it's like, this doesn't happen to these types of families. It happens to lower incomes. It happens to foreigners, different things like that. It doesn't happen to us that are just, middle class or upper middle class families. Wow. So it's more of having that shame involved in that. I can only imagine so many people experiencing shame and wanting just to hide versus wants to, reveal oneself and be a little bit more authentic. Yeah. But when you share something as intense as that and no one receives it or they don't believe it, it makes you question your reality. Did that happen to you?
Oh yeah. And it ended down a dark path, got married. The second person is like I started drawing these predators. That person tried to sell me to a drug dealer and everything, and didn't tell my parents, my brothers, or anything. So it was like I was just going down this this path, and it was like, oh my gosh. And I can just tell you, by the grace of God, that's how I got out, because after we had 2 children, that's when he tried to, and I
my healing process was in my first book, Shattered No More. And that began the healing process, and then my first song. And then, and just once I started telling my story, people that you wouldn't expect comes up to you and starts telling their stories. So it was a release for other people. Yeah.
So you saw it not just to waste your pain and go through it and become bitter, but you saw it as a vehicle to create a book, to create a song. And when you let your own light shine, you unconsciously gave others the permission to let their light shine. One of my favorite poems. So like, what was like the turning point for you? Because you said you got married, you felt like you were attracting these things and you were going down this path. What was that turning point that led you to become an author?
It was God, because I had no desire to be. I'm not going to say didn't want to be an author. When I was in school, before all these things happened, I was on a journalism team and everything else. Okay. So it was my dream. But all the time I was growing up, everyone kept saying, you can't be. And it was more because I was the only minority black girl in my classes. So they kept saying, no, you can't do that. You need to go do this. Or you need to go do that.
What did they say specifically you needed to do?
They told me I needed to go do something that would be in service or to service other people. That's what they told me. So I'm 53 years old. So back then it was like, I think Cosby shows, different things like that were just coming out. So it wasn't, and I don't believe that all of it was malicious, but they were just like, this hasn't been done. Because I told my first teacher when I was in junior high school, I want to be an author. And they're like, that's not possible for you. And so I was like, and then even while I was in school, they were talking about slavery and all these different things going on, and the teachers were letting all the kids make fun of us. And then that was my first indication I was going to be an advocate and a justice fighter, because I said the 4 kids that were in our class out of the 100 and something, I was like, come with me, we're leaving, we're going to the principal office. And so and I had the teacher, he had to come back and apologize in front of the whole class because he didn't stop everyone making fun of us. So is those things that children are learned or taught at a young age that starts putting it in their DNA. And then what we have to do, and that's why I started Loving Our Children and the AIM program, to help kids unlearn it or make sure the kids don't get that in the first place, that they're informed, they're instructed, and they're matured in who they really are.
Wow. Yeah. You had 2 choices in that moment while being laughed at, of just succumbing to it and getting small, but you decided to become an advocate, and then you enlisted the people around you and said, hey, this is unacceptable. We're going to go find a way to address this. Like, what was that in you that said, you know what, I have to advocate for these other people versus just playing small?
I would think I learned that from my mother. She led the first riot here in town, also with the NAACP against the rights for people that worked in the housekeeping sector. Wow. So she did that, and then and then my father on his side, every year when he came to guide us after we got divorced, he would always tell me, Cynthia, you can do anything you want to do. Don't ever let anyone tell you can't. He would take me to in places and restaurants that we may be the only ones there, and he says, you belong here. So I think both my parents, even though they weren't together anymore, they still instilled that you can do anything that you want to do, and don't let anyone else put you in a box.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm just grateful for your vulnerability and your transparency to share such intense parts of your life in a way that is going to inspire so many listeners right now. So like, with all of that you've experienced, right? Trying to be trafficked at an early age, and then the second, getting married, and then after the 2 kids, trying to get trafficked to a drug dealer, and then, getting laughed at a young age about wanting to become an author and being told that you can't. What has impacted you in a way that now you're teaching to change lives? You talked about the first book and that being an outlet. Can you talk more about that?
Right. And I have a 3rd child and he was inspirational mostly out of that. He's my child, is like carbon copy in so many different ways, but he started having that same subjection.
So then when it got to the grandchildren, then my grandson, he was starting to have that. So I'm like, okay, this is a cycle. I need to figure out how we break this, even though you have these children, my grandkids, they have greatness within them. And just like I had greatness within me, but I was always told I'm not great. So I was like, how do we break that? So that was one of the motivators in that. So I'm not going to let someone, no matter what race, color, or place they come, or religion, to be downtrodden. That's not who we are as a human race. We shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And so that was my motivation, to break the cycle. I always say, open the circle, break the cycle.
Open the circle. So in your experience, like, have you healed and recovered from all of those experiences you faced?
Yes. My next book actually is Mended. So it's called Mended Devotional, and it helps us walk through all the things that I walked through. So then, before I was like very closed and conservative. No one knew anything about me. People that I may have worked with for like 10, 20 years, they didn't even know anything about me. And then it's just when I became healed, I'm like, how can I not share this with everyone else? Other people are going through this. So it would be selfish of me to keep it all to myself.
It reminds me of one of my favorite speakers, Jim Rohn. He talks about how the graveyard is the richest place in the world, because a lot of great ideas go to die, and just all these projects and these inventions that just go that doesn't take root and doesn't produce any fruit. So you decided to not waste just your pain, but you transformed it into passion, and now you're sharing it with others. When I say the word teaching to change lives, based off your experiences, based on what you've done and what you're doing, what does that mean to you, teaching to change lives?
I believe that teaching to change lives means that we empower people to have their own personal strength, that no one else has control over your personal power, but we also have to affirm them. We have to instruct them, because many people don't know how to even explore who they really are, and then help them to mature and walk alongside them. You can call it mentoring, you can call it discipleship, whatever you want to call it, but they need that maturing part. There's many people that have talents and gifts inside of them, but they don't know how to express them. And especially people that are artistic, they are all over the place, and you have to learn how to harness them in to be able to be stable too, but don't lose the creativity part. So you have to be have a strategy when you deal with people, but you have to spend the time with them. And that's the part where the disciple or the mentoring part comes in, where if you don't get to know a person, you really can't help direct them.
We can't influence if we're not connected.
Yes.
The good book talks about my sheep knows my voice. And when you're talking about life on life discipleship, life on life application, you're walking with them. So if imagine if I came from Mars, right? I'm just like, I'm from Mars, and then I come on Earth, and Cynthia, you're the first person I see on Earth, and you are just inspired and just engrossed with this concept, empowerment. Now you have to teach me what empowerment is. What is empowerment?
Empowerment is being able to know who you are and why you exist, and then putting it into action.
Who you are, why you know it exists, and then put it into action.
Yes.
That's solid.
Yes.
That's solid. I think it's so interesting. Oftentimes, right, I talk to a lot of speakers and a lot of leaders, and they use these fancy words, and they're just like, yeah, we're going to empower, or we're going to love, right? We're going to all these things, and oftentimes we say things and we don't quite understand the gravity it holds. And I also often says, like, what does empowerment mean, right? It's one thing to know it intellectually, but how do I live it out? And you're talking about putting it into action, which is amazing. Now, the government sector, right? You work with government, you've worked with private and nonprofit. What department did you work in? Like, how involved were you with government?
I was in the Air Force. I was in the Air Force for a little while, but and then I worked civil service. Then I was contracting overseas for about 8 years in the Middle East and different Germany and different places like that. So I was very involved. And then I was on IG teams in all kinds of quality is mostly what